Okay, so with that, why don't we go ahead and get started? We're a couple minutes after the top of the hour. Again, this is Maury Galbraith. I'm the Executive Director at the Western Interstate Energy Board, and we are really pleased to be working with the Southwest Power Pool to assist them with their governance design for their Markets Plus initiative. We are fortunate to have several speakers with us today to help us better understand the governance design and to allow state energy office officials, state utility regulators, and state staff to ask questions about that design and get a better understanding of it. We will be hosting some additional webinars in the future to try and work with the states to come to some consensus views and potentially some consensus comments on the governance design. So thank you for joining. It's my pleasure to introduce Kara Fornstrom, who is the Director of State Regulatory Policy at the Southwest Power Pool. Kara and her team are going to walk us through some of these design principles, design concepts today. So with that, Kara, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Maury. Good morning, everyone. Can we start with the slides? I want to thank WIEB for facilitating these discussions. We're grateful for them playing this role, and I also want to thank our stakeholder leads for playing such an important part in this process as well. You'll hear mostly from them today, but I want to get us started off with reviewing the agenda for this morning's call. Next slide, please. We're going to start by me just giving you a quick overview of Markets Plus, and then Joe will walk us through a review of the activities of the governance design team that we've been doing this year. And then David will walk us through the schematics of the governance options that the stakeholders have been discussing over the past few months. Ali will then walk us through the matrices of those options. We had an in-person meeting in Phoenix a couple of weeks ago where we had breakout sessions for the governance discussions. And we walked through these matrices and developed some real consensus around what the group is leaning towards and where they want to see the governance design go. So Ali will summarize that process and walk through those matrices. And then it'll come back to me to talk about the remaining design elements for the Markets Plus service offering. And then we'll talk about next steps and schedule. We have put slides in at the end of each segment for questions and discussion. So we will be pausing throughout this presentation for questions, but if you have something in the meantime, please don't hesitate to put it in the chat, but we will get to all of your questions today and discuss whatever topics that you would like. Next slide, please. So as I said, I'm going to start with a quick overview of the Markets Plus initiative. Next slide, please. This slide really summarizes the various activities that SPP has in the West. We are developing the RTO in the West. We expect those entities to be joining the existing RTO that will now go across the interconnection. It will be one RTO operating in two BAs, one in the West and one in the East. And those conversations are continuing. We obviously also have our imbalance service market, the WIEB, which launched in February of last year. It is growing. We have added members to or participants to that contract service that we are offering. Markets Plus is the one that is underway today. We launched this late last year and have been working diligently all of this year on several design teams, which I'll talk about in more detail, to develop a service offering later this year, and I'll provide that timeline in a little bit. We also offer a reliability coordination service, which launched when peak dissolved. We've been doing that since December of 2019. And the Western Interconnection and Scheduled Flow Mitigation Plan. And then obviously we are the program operator for the WRAP. And you can see there the goals that we have there on the right for all of these contract services that we offer, and then for the expansion of the RTO. Next slide, please. If you can just hit that a couple of times, this one's animated. We'll just get all three of these on here. So on the left, you'll see kind of the current path. We've had significant developments on the resource adequacy regional work with the WRAP program, which has been exciting for the entire West. And then we have the EIM and the WISE currently operating. EDAM is the potential, as you'll see there on the left. Then in the middle, you'll see the services that a full RTO offers, including some transmission service offerings that are there on the top. with the addition of resource adequacy, the day ahead market, the real-time market, and reliability coordinator. What Markets Plus does is it adds some services to the existing services of an energy imbalance service, for example, but it doesn't go full-blown RTO. And you can see those three buckets on the top there related to transmission that are not included in a Markets Plus design that would be offered in a full RTO. So that's really the difference between the energy imbalance component and the RTO and where Markets Plus fits into those service offerings. Next slide, please. So when we introduced Markets Plus late last year, we highlighted that these are the 8 issues, design elements that we believe are critical to a successful service offering for Markets Plus. After we introduced it, had a few webinars last year, we issued a survey to interested parties to get their feedback on a lot of different things. When they want to see something like this launched, their interest level, how many hours a week they'd be willing to devote to it. But we also asked them to rank for us in priority these 8 issues, which ones were most important to them to deal with in the first tranche. And it was very clear to us, the results of those, which one we should go first. Probably to no surprise to everyone on this call, governance ranked as the most important issue. And then we saw transmission availability rise to the top, as well as accurate price formation and market products. So we then looked at those results and formed 3 design teams, one for governance, one for transmission availability, and then we combined the price formation and market products into one design team. Those 3 design teams have been meeting independently since January. And then once a month, we all come back together and have what we call a big tent meeting, formerly called our development updates. And that's when each design team provides an update about what they've been doing. And we talk about things to come and the schedule, et cetera. So that's been the process that we have been using since January. And I'll touch on those other 4 issues and when we'll be dealing with those as well. Next slide, please. So this is the transmission availability team. Consistent with SPP culture, we have, and one of the things that we asked for in that survey were volunteers for stakeholders to lead these issues. Doesn't mean that you're not involved if you're not a stakeholder lead. We have about 100 people on each one of these calls, but these leads have stepped up and help us with planning for those meetings. And you'll see today our stakeholder leads take significant portions of the topics and lead the group through that. So you'll see some great diversity here. Joe Taylor from Excel, Chris Hoffman from Salt River Project, and Mike Lynn from PPC. And then the SPP support team is Steve Johnson and Hamilton Bitely. Next slide. I won't go through this one in detail, but this gives you an idea of what the transmission availability design team has been working on, what their goal is. And you'll see there on the right, that schematic really shows what we believe is important about how this will work. The governance and oversight is critically important, as is the market design, which builds confidence, which will increase participation and encourage people to provide their transmission into the Markets Plus offering, which then leads back to a good market design. So obviously a critical component. They have some interesting issues that they're dealing with, and you can find out more about their meetings on our website. Next slide, please. This is the market products and price formation design team. You'll see there again, great leadership from across the West. Jeff Spires from PowerX, Carrie Simpson from Excel, Brian Cole from APS, and Russ Manafelt from BPA. And then we have a support team there of Jim Gonzalez and Micah Bailey. Next slide, please. These are their key decision topics. Again, I won't go through all of these. You can find more about their meetings on our website, but these are the issues that they're tackling. Next slide, please. And their process is to take those topics and put them into these kind of groupings. The significant effort right now is what Jim calls the no-brainer issues. What can we get consensus around? What does everyone believe are the easy issues? We can put those aside, have consensus on those, and then work forward on these other issues that fall into these other categories. Next slide, please. All right, so that is a brief introduction about where we've been, sort of where we are. I'm happy to take any questions about that now before I turn it over, I think, to Joe for the next piece. Any questions so far?
Yeah, Kara, this is Eric from the Colorado PEC. Just a quick question on context. As I understand it, and I just realized this a few days ago, that the WISE market, the energy imbalance market, is at some point in the future going to sunset as entities join the RTO and the Markets Plus Day Ahead market. Do you expect something like that to happen in the future with Markets Plus as entities join the full RTO? Do you expect the Markets Plus to sunset, or do you think that's going to be a permanent option? I was just surprised that WISE is going away. So any guidance or thinking about where this goes in the long term? I just have some concerns about the full RTO. So just want to know if Markets Plus is going to be there for the long term.
Thank you, Chairman. Great to see you. Good question. So let's just start real quickly with the WISE. So most of those members, with the participants, with the exception of the XLBA, will have moved already to the RTO expansion. That will happen before Markets Plus launches. So the WISE will have shrunk before we get to Markets Plus. And the remaining entities in WISE that we have today have expressed their interest to go to the full market, to go to Markets Plus rather than just the real-time service. So it's based on their interest level on adding the day ahead service, within the addition that we don't intend to have 3 different offerings in the West. So there will be some timing issues associated with WISE converting to the Markets Plus, so it won't be immediate, but we will do that absolutely with consultation of those participants and their willingness to move. It won't be mandated by SPP, but we understand that that's what they want. So that's what we're working towards. But as it relates to Markets Plus, for your question, we believe it is a long-term durable solution. Others will move, some will move to the RTO. They will move at different paces. We've heard it, it covers the spectrum. People that want to go quickly, some that want to wait a little bit, kind of get their feet wet, have it be a more incremental thing. There are others who have indicated to us that they want to stay in Markets Plus. And so we anticipate that will be a long-term solution in the West.
Appreciate the clarification. Thank you.
Sure, you're welcome. Any other questions? Commissioner Tawny.
Good morning. Thanks for doing this. Just to follow up on that, I have been trying to follow some of the calls, and I'm curious. I had understood that there won't be co-optimization between the RTO and Markets Plus. So your answer on the long-term trajectory, does it envision that you'll move to co-optimization, or does it not, and the sort of the 2 footprints will remain separated and Markets Plus will sort of shrink?
Thanks, Commissioner Tawny. We do anticipate as a phase 2 project that Markets Plus and the RTO will be co-optimized. In fact, we've had discussions about that in the governance discussions, and you'll see that when we get to the models, the different components of the framework. We're already anticipating a joint governance working group between Markets Plus and the RTO to cover issues of joint concern like co-optimization. We want to address as much as we can what that governance structure would look like, since it would involve both markets. And so that is something that I think most of the participants are interested in. SPP is as well. Some of this will depend on the ultimate market design for Markets Plus. To the extent we're using the same market engine and those are pretty closely aligned, obviously co-optimization becomes a much easier task than it would be otherwise. So some of those issues have to be worked out in some other design teams, but it is the intention, I believe, at this point of all the parties and SPP that there would be co-optimization in the future.
So that'll mean co-optimization across the interties, because the RTO is co-optimizing as you envision it right now, or designing it right now, co-optimizing across the interties, right?
So there are a number of ties, 4 ties that are involved in the expansion of the RTO across the interconnection. So those will already be in the market. Those will be in the RTO. There's another tie, the Lamar tie, that Excel owns. And so to the extent that they would be in Markets Plus, we would have to deal with the DC tie there. But the DC tie issue should be dealt with in the RTO expansion. That's actually the issue that we're trying to conclude now to finalize the RTO expansion. So it will largely be done. The footprint will be into the Western interconnection by then. and Markets Plus would then co-optimize with the existing RTO that is already across those ties.
That's really helpful to understand. So when we are thinking about what you're describing for governance, we should be envisioning it as co-optimizing with the RTO, and so integrating in some fashion with the decision-making that's happening in the Eastern Interconnect and that the RSC is involved in, and so on. Am I sort of understanding the scope correctly, or am I off base on the scope of what you're sort of describing?
I think you're really close. The co-optimization and the joint governance will be at a market working group level. These are not issues that are delegated to the RSC, for example. It will go through our Market Operations Policy Committee for the RTO governance structure, the MOPSI, and there'll be a working group established. They have a market working group, standing working group. So as we envision it today, there would be representatives from that market working group working in a task force fashion with Markets Plus representatives, participants probably in the technical committee, to come up with a joint proposal and the market rules for how co-optimization would work. And then they would take that back up through their autonomous governance structures for ultimate approval. Okay. And the states may have roles in each one of those. The state committee and Markets Plus would review that and be involved in those discussions, but it would start at a technical market working group kind of level.
Okay, that's really helpful to understand. And I look forward to understanding, as you continue the discussion of your markets options, sort of helping us understand when is a decision going to go to which governing body will continue to be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Okay. Any other questions? Nicole Hughes just raised the issue about a visual. I think that is coming up. So a schematic that we have that shows how these different things relate. And I think Joe's going to cover that. So I'll hand it over to him now, and we'll continue through the slides, and we'll have another pause for questions here in a few moments. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Kara. If we can go to the next slide. I'm Joe Fina, and I work for the Snohomish County PUD. I am one of the 5 stakeholder leads here that you see. And today you're going to be hearing from Allie and also from David. Sarah Edmonds is you're probably going to be leading our group since she's been taking on some new roles, and Leah Fisher, many of you know, wasn't able to be with us today. But and I also just want to recognize the Southwest Power Pool support team. They've been great to work with, Kara and everyone else. So it's been great, working with them, and the progress we've made so far, I think, is a real combination of the leads and the support team. So I want to start off by providing a review of the work of the governance design team to date, and to kind of set the stage for the presentation and the discussion on the governance options that are planned for later today. So next slide. So we've had 5 design team meetings. 4 of them have been virtual, and the last one was a 2-day meeting that was in person out in Phoenix. And let me just kind of walk through what we talked about at each of these meetings to kind of give you an idea of how we've been progressing. So at our first meeting, we focus on the operational relationships to really develop an understanding, a foundational understanding of what it is that we were going to govern, and how Markets Plus fits in with the other Western services. At the February 14th meeting, we took a look at the topics that are in scope for the governance design team. And we also propose a set of governance objectives for our work, which we thought were really important. At the February 28th meeting, we heard a detailed overview from SPP CEO Barbara Sugg on SPP's board of directors, and learned about the corporate governance committee that oversees the board election process. And we also presented an overview of the WIES and the RC governance frameworks. At the March 14th meeting, we provided a high-level set of options for the governance framework, and we had a really good discussion with the stakeholders. And most recently, in Phoenix, we started off with a general governance overview to kind of level set, and then we've really delved into the different options that we had discussed previously, kind of narrowed those a little bit. And as Kara mentioned before, we created matrices for each one of the options with the various areas of interest and the potential paths, approaches under each one. Next slide. Okay, so this is a great slide. So this shows how the different Western energy market services are going to work together. Regarding energy imbalance services, you can see that both the CAISO EIM and the WISE market are both faded out. And as we just talked about, the WISE will be replaced by Markets Plus. And for those members, and for those folks that are members of the CAISO EIM, they would have to leave and join in order to join Markets Plus. The slide also depicts the relationship between Markets Plus and the SPP RTO. The SPP RTO is there in pink on the far right, and the dotted line is the interconnection, and you can see that the RTO East is moving its way over to the west. So I like to call the initial phase of this phase one, where we'll have a Western optimized market, and then once we kind of get that off the ground, as we've been talking about, there would be a phase two, and this would also involve the governance, of course, to address issues between Markets Plus and the RTO. And in an ideal setting, there would be a single co-optimized unit commitment and the dispatch between those two markets. And what we're thinking about, and we mentioned this already, is that there would be a joint task force between the Markets Plus and the SPP RTO that would work together on the joint issues as they may come up. And then they would each go into their respective governance frameworks, go through that process, and if it's positive on each side, then it becomes a reality. And the intended relationship with the CAISO is to have market-to-market optimized transfers, and then perhaps in the future there would also be their relationship between the SPP RTO and also CAISO, but that's a little bit into the future. Okay, next slide. Okay, so during our meetings, we came up with the list of, okay, here are the issues that the governance design team is going to tackle, and here are the issues that are kind of outside of scope, for us. At the top of the list is the board of directors, and so we're looking at questions like whether there should be any changes to the SPP board qualifications to make sure that there's regional diversity, and there's a role for the markets plus participants, for instance, on the corporate and governance committee that we'll talk about a little bit. In addition, one of the options, we're looking at a governing body, and we want to make sure that there's a nominating committee there, and there's a role for everyone to participate in that. With regard, I see we have a question. So will there be a single optimized model, protocol, and business practices over SPP? Yeah, so that's a good question. There I'm sure will need to be something worked out. We're not quite sure what process will be in place to tackle those issues. We're at the point now, and I'll let you all know, I think you all know this, is that we're just getting the general framework in, and we're going to be putting together a draft concept paper here by the end of May, and the idea is that we'll just build on that. And I think part of that building probably in the next 2 or 3 steps will be how we tackle some of these more detailed issues with the co-optimized model. Sorry. Yes, hopefully that answered your question. So I think let's see, we left off on the committee framework. Issues there are, I think, to include what the composition of the standing committees will be, whether we should have working groups, whether we should figure all that out now or wait until later. Voting structures, we want to be sure that when we're discussing voting structure and the memberships across committees, that we have all that in place and it's done in a fair way. Jurisdiction, what the role of the state commissions will be over this, and also trying to make sure that we address concerns of the non-FERC jurisdictional participating entities, or those entities that are thinking about participating. And then how can market participants leave? What details do we need to figure out around that? Okay, next slide. Okay, so the governance objectives. As a stakeholder leads, we felt that it was important to kind of establish a foundation with these goals in mind as we work through all these issues. And these objectives really center on a few themes. We have independence, then we have representation. I want to make sure that there is transparency and inclusivity. An independent board in the decision-making that is free from bias is really a hallmark of an independent governance structure. And so that's just really, really important. That we recognize that a board must not only be independent, but should also be comprised of board members that have skills and experience that are that reflect the region in all the interests of the market participants. It's also really important that the process and rules that we develop around around how stakeholders can be involved in the Markets Plus. It must be open, transparent, workable for everyone. There must be inclusivity and representation in any board nomination process. And as we'll get into a little bit later when we go over the governance options, we've considered kind of a model of what that could look like. And then lastly, we recognize that it's going to be important to establish dedicated and effective forums and committees for the stakeholders within the governance framework. So next slide.
Could I, Joe, this is
Sure.
Commissioner Tani in Oregon. Could I, just on that past slide, could I just ask for some clarity? Because I think there's vocabulary that gets used in different ways. And on that first bullet, I see where you've articulated stakeholders, and I think on the second and fourth bullet, and I think what I hear you saying in that version of stakeholder is sort of broader than the paying market participants. So I'd love confirmation on that. But I'm curious what you mean when you say interests on the first bullet. I heard you say the board needs to be able to sort of represent the breadth of the interests of the market participants, but I'm not hearing other interests at that board level. Am I overreading that, or am I hearing your language correctly? Just would love some specificity about how you're thinking about how you use those words, just so that
Hey,
we
Joe,
know.
do you mind if I interject really quickly?
Sure.
So Commissioner Tani, we actually have a lot more of this information on the slides that I'm going to cover coming up here,
Okay.
in terms of what we're thinking about based on the meetings that we've had so far. So can we come back to your question if it's not answered in those slides?
That sounds great. That sounds really
Okay.
helpful. I just know that in different forums, we use the words differently, and I just want to make sure we're all clear in our own heads so that we're able to have a conversation that's effective. So thanks for that.
Yes, we have definitely thought through this. So sorry to interrupt you, Joe. I was like, we're gonna get there. So let us get there. And if we don't answer your question sufficiently, then we definitely can come back to it.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Okay. So the Southwest Power Pools Board of Directors. So the governance structure that we're going to be thinking about here, and the various options that we have, will all lead up to the SPP Board of Directors. So that's why we're talking about it today. So let's talk about them. They have so the board is made up of currently 9 members, and it's an independent board. Meets the FERC independent board requirements of an RTO and ISO, and SPP has been around for quite a while, and it includes the SPP CEO. And under its bylaws, there have to be at least 7 board members, but it can go up to 10. There is one vacancy today, but my understanding is that a search is underway, and it should be completed by the end of this year. The members of the board are proposed by the CGC. For election, and then voted on by the entire SPP membership. None of the directors, this is an interesting note, live within the Southwest Power Pool footprint, and there are no term limits, but each board of directors serves 3-year terms. There is diversity amongst the board. Ranges from various experiences on the energy side, the telecommunications, finance, legal, regulatory. And the two of the directors are located in the West. Mark Risson, who many of you may recall from Tacoma Power, and also a former president at APPA, and John Caparo. He's in Oregon, and he's formerly with the Pacific Corps, and he recently joined in January. So let's move on to the next slide. So these are the qualifications for the board of directors that are in the bylaws. And we had Barbara Sugg present to one of our public meetings about a month or so ago, and she mentioned that this is a little bit outdated, but noted that SPP isn't limited in particular to all of these. For instance, in the recent board member with John joining, they were looking for someone that had experience in the WEC. So there will be chances to update and to modify this list. Okay, next slide. Let's talk about the corporate governance committee. So the CGC serves as a nominating committee for the board, and it also has other duties, such as considering changes to the bylaws and membership agreements. The current makeup of the CGC, there's representation from many different sectors, and all of these sector reps are all SPP members. There was a question, I think, that I just missed. Did the group ever define a stakeholder after the Phoenix meeting to include broad types of organizations? We haven't gotten there specifically, but I envision though that definition will be fairly broad. Okay, next slide. So next, I'm going to provide just a brief summary of the governance frameworks of two of the SPP's contract services, and I'll start with the RC services. So there's an executive committee that's responsible for developing and recommending policies, procedures, system enhancements related to the technical operations of the RC customers that are then given to the SPP, a reliability coordinator. And each RC customer appoints one representative to the WREC. Is it? And then underneath that, there's a working group, and that group takes on individual issues as they come up from a technical standpoint. And then again, it kind of moves up the chain, up to the committee. And then underneath that, there are different task forces that are focused on more specific issues as it comes up. One point of note is that this framework is separate from the RC efforts over on the SPP East side. Okay, next slide. The WISE governance. So SPP administers the WISE again as a contract service, and that's what we're thinking about when we're thinking about your Markets Plus as well. And it's separate from the RTO. And so the WISE has its own tariff. To participate in the WISE, there's an agreement. It's a pro forma that has to be signed, and SPP's board provides the ultimate oversight of the WISE, but gives a significant recognition to the executive committee and their decision-making role. That committee is comprised of representatives that have signed what's called the Western Joint Dispatch Agreement. And the committee has authority to approve or reject proposed amendments to the WISE tariff. It can establish the market protocols. They provide consultation to SPP in determining the administrative rate that's charged to participants of the WISE, and also any proposed changes to the dispatch agreement. The Western Markets Working Group are the groups that the executive committee may establish to do its business, and also one commissioner from the Regulatory Commission of each state in which a WISE participant has load participating in the WISE market may participate as the state liaison to that committee. And there hasn't been liaison as of yet, but I believe that this will change starting in 2023, given the membership of new participants in that market. So next slide.
Joe, sorry to interrupt. This is
Yep.
Commissioner Tani. I wonder if you could articulate for me what you envision the role of that state liaison to be, or what is their, I see the line down to the Western Markets Executive Committee. Are they advisory? What access do they have? Can you help us understand what you envision there? I recognize it's not been utilized yet, but what's in the sort of the governing documents?
Sure. So this is just, we're showing this as an example of what the current WISE governance is. For Markets Plus, and you'll see this a little bit later on, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. We will have a separate state committee that will have a different role than what the WISE governance structure currently has. So it will be quite different, I think. And I think Ali or David may address that a little bit later.
Yeah, this was Commissioner Tani. This is not what we are envisioning for Markets Plus. This is what is it currently in existence for WISE.
Yeah, we thought it would be good as a comparison to see what is currently in place and then what it is that we're currently considering.
Okay, all right. I was trying to understand how you've set up decision making, but that's fine. We can go on to what you're thinking about for Markets Plus, since WISE will sunset here.
Okay, all right, thanks. So next slide. So we've before we get into the various options that we're thinking about on the governance structure, you just wanted to go through what it is that we're trying to tackle and to address. So the first is enabling the Market Plus participants to have a vote in the nominating committee process for the board of directors. We want an effective and not overly burdensome committee structure. You're recognizing demands of stakeholders have in participating in other governance structures. We've talked about a plan about the two markets coming together. So we want to ensure that there's a way for cooperation on areas of joint concern with SPP RTO, but also possibly with the WRAP. We also want to tackle the question of what kind of authority would a Markets Plus governing board or an executive committee have, and the importance of ensuring that issues that are kind of over in the Markets Plus camp are within the purview of that governance structure established just for Markets Plus. Lastly, we want to create a pathway for Markets Plus participants to move over into the RTO if they so choose to, and how the governance structure for Markets Plus will work and perhaps evolve, and depending on how many members leave and whether they stay. So these are all questions that we're thinking about, and we're looking forward to more discussion and also input from stakeholders on how to proceed. Okay, next slide. And why don't we move over to the next slide? Something really neat that we did, Phoenix, and I'm not sure who came up with this idea, but whoever it was, thank you. is that we had a panel in our first breakout governance session, that was very diverse, and the panel provided some really good governance perspectives. Now we don't want to hold anybody to what it is that they said, because it was just high level kind of initial thoughts, but it varied from the general to specific, and it really provided an excellent foundation for the discussions that came later during that meeting that we had, and we especially want to thank Commissioner Cordova for making time to participate, and all the other panelists. But with that, I think, if you go to the next slide, I think I'm done for my portion. Thanks for hanging in there with me, but happy to answer any questions that anyone may have before moving on. I see we have a hand up.
Carly, go ahead with your
Hi.
question.
This is Carly Page. I'm a policy advisor for the Nevada Commission. I apologize, a lawnmower just started up behind me. So I guess my general question is, it looks like there is some flexibility for maybe having, at least Markets Plus, having slightly different governance or slightly different rules, depending on what the Western interconnection folks might need to get this whole markets thing organized. What is the appetite for that difference from the Eastern interconnection, how that works, and how inefficient is maintaining that separate potential governance structure or separate business practices relative to the East? Is it something that is going to be disastrous for SPP staff, or ruin the efficiencies of having one SPP by having these little carve outs or different rules for the West, depending on specific needs?
So Carly, I'm going to just jump in and say we are going to talk a lot about what we're envisioning in terms of the separate market governance. So again, give us a few minutes, but Kara, maybe you can speak to the comment or the question about SPP staff and how you all are gearing up to have these separate markets work and still maintain some of those efficiencies.
Thanks, Sally, and thanks, Carly, for the question. So just the biggest distinction here is that, like WISE and our RC services, Markets Plus will be a contract service offered by SPP. It is separate from the RTO. And as a contract service, it has its own budget, it has its own governance structure. And so it will be completely separate, with the exception of the SPP board and whatever role they play in Markets Plus. But it is autonomous, it is separate, it has its own budget, so it'll have its own FTEs. When we put out the draft service offering, we'll start putting some numbers to what that looks like to support the governance structure, the market design, that the West is designing for itself. We'll try to put some numbers to that, to what this service offering will cost, but it will be completely separate and have its own budget and its own people. There'll be some overlap, obviously, but it'll be similar to how we operate our other contract services.
Thank you, Kara. Thank you, Carly. This is Maury Galbraith. I'm going to jump in and just do a time check here. We have about 40 more minutes for our webinar here. So I'm going to turn things over to Allie. And we've got some important concepts coming up. We've got some governance design options, and we've got some governance design evaluation matrices that we want to get to, folks. So just keep an eye on the clock, Allie and David, as you're going through it.
So I think, Dave, are you first?
Yes, David goes next.
Yeah, and I promise I'll talk quickly because everybody wants to get to the stuff that Allie's covering. If we could get to the next slide. And one more after that. Okay. I'm going to attempt to sort of outline the structure of the two options that we discussed at the Phoenix meeting, and then turn the presentation over to Allie to review the feedback that we received. I should also stress that the governance design is very much a work in progress, and that stakeholders are preparing comments to help us develop a straw proposal. This slide and the next one are meant to convey the same information in different ways. Both options, 2A and 2B, build off a common framework. The most significant difference is that option 2A vests primary oversight over Market Plus under a new separate independent governing board. This could be similar to CAISO's EIM governing body with a delegated approach, but with much more primary authority. Whereas option 2B would have the Market Plus operational committees report directly to the SPP Board of Governors. Under both approaches, there would be a committee of state authorities, and consistent with the principles that we received, there will be future discussions on ensuring the meaningful role in policy development, access to information, staffing and funding, and any other topics of concern. Under both options 2A and 2B is the possibility of adding option 3, which would be a modification to the SPP bylaws to add a Market Plus representation to the existing SPP Corporate Governance Committee with respect to the selection of the SPP board members. And the thought here being that if the Market Plus program is under the ultimate auspices of the SPP Board of Governors, there should be participation in the selection of those governors. This may be of increased significance in option 2B, as the SPP board would have more direct oversight. So let's start with the common elements to both the 2A and 2B approaches, and this may be easier. If I could have the next slide. Okay, in the upper right is the Market Plus working group. The thought is this could be a sector-based committee tasked with the initial review of market design initiatives, that is, potential changes to the Market Plus tariff or business practice manuals. Similar to the Program Review Committee and RAP, this work group could include representation from public interest organizations, consumer advocacy groups, and the state committee. In other words, the box in the slide in orange there showing the state committee interacting only with the executive committee is too limiting, and there should be certainly a line to the working group as well. Below the working group box in light green is a box indicating there may be the need to form subgroups or working groups on particular issues, and one that I think Joe and Kara have talked about is the need potentially for a Market Plus to incorporate many of the same bidding and schedule processes as SPP runs for the RTO optimization. And so it may be important to discuss design elements jointly between the Market Plus participants and SPP's Market and Operations Policy Committee members. Issues reviewed by the working group would then be brought to the Market Plus Executive Committee. And a few thoughts here. First, who is a participant would need to be defined, but it certainly would be more than a participating transmission owner. It should include independent power producers, marketers, and load serving entities with obligations under the Market Plus tariff. Second, while it's expected that the Market Plus Executive Committee could render an opinion on an initiative, a negative vote would not prevent a stakeholder from bringing it up to the board. As shown in this slide in green under option 2B, the appeal would be to the SPP board. As shown in blue under option 2A, the appeal would go to the separate Market Plus board. And then staying with the Market Plus board, the box in the bottom right recognizes that if you have a separate Market Plus board, you should have a sector-based nominating committee to select the members of that board. And then continuing with the theme of adding lines from the state committee, we would certainly add lines to the nominating committee as well as to the Market Plus board. Option 2A certainly adds a relationship between the Market Plus board and the SPP board, and this would require definition. But the trade-off here, not to steal Allie's thunder, but got a lot of support in Phoenix, was a board with a much more focus and attention solely to the Western market. And with that, I'll ask for any questions before turning it over to Allie.
Allie, you are, yeah.
All right. So can we just go to the next slide, please? Next slide, please. Thank you. Wonderful. So just this is where I wanted to really get to Commissioner Tawny's question to start. And I think Carly asked a very similar question in terms of definitions. So there are some definitions that we wanted to just get out there right off the bat. One of them is when we're talking about members, which you probably won't hear us say much in this conversation, we're really talking about SPP RTO members. So members is the term that we will use for the full RTO participants. When we're talking about market participants, that's where we're talking in terms of SPP Markets Plus. And the market participants, as Dave just mentioned, are going to be broader than just balancing areas. So we definitely need to be thinking about both the load and supply in a day ahead market. So market participants are those that would be have obligations under the tariff. So that could include independent power producers or generators. It could include marketers. It could include other load serving entities that have obligations under the tariff. So that's a really key distinction that we wanted to call out. And then stakeholders would be really anyone else who has an interest in the market. So we would see that as being public interest organizations, consumer advocates, frankly, state regulators, staff of state regulators, but obviously the state regulators are going to have a much more defined role in terms of their own separate body or committee. But the stakeholders that we're talking about are going to be sort of broad-based. And we did talk about if there should be some type of pay to play model for the stakeholders. What we heard was the current SPP model for stakeholder participation, which requires a nominal fee, an annual fee to participate, but then also requires a pretty significant bond for exit. I think it's a $50,000 bond that has to be kept, or some type of default provision, something like that, that has to be kept on the books. that's really prohibitive. So what we were thinking about is for obviously not state regulators, but those outside of that group of stakeholders, that there might still be a nominal fee so that we made sure that folks that were participating had a little bit of skin in the game and frankly could support some of the administrative costs. But currently that fee is in the $6,000 range annually to have a official stakeholder participation place, if you will, that seem to be supported by the various entities in the room. You know, we can talk about what that cost is or if it's absolutely necessary for this, but it is something that we did talk about as potentially being something that we would continue on with SPP Markets Plus. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to talk about this a little bit because I think ultimately we did end up landing on the 2A option as being the one that we're going to try and really test out and make into a robust proposal. But there were some pros and cons to having an executive committee, including lower cost and ease of implementation. Obviously, the cons there are it's very complicated in terms of decisional authority, not necessarily independent, and that also causes a lot of distrust and transparency type issues. So, the governing board model is absolutely a very useful mechanism to build trust. We would expect this to be an independent board that met all of the FERC independence criteria. They would have independent decision-making authority, accessibility, transparency, all of the things that you would expect from an independent board. It is obviously, in turn that you're going to have increased costs and some complexity with that, but we think it's an absolutely necessary trade-off to build the type of trust and independent decision-making that we need for this market. So next slide. Before I get into these matrices, Commissioner Tawney and Carly, did I answer your question regarding what we're thinking about for those definitions sufficiently?
Thanks, Sally. This is Commissioner Tawney. I appreciate that. Going back to the way you were articulating your vision for the for that board, I heard the specific use of the word interests of the market participants, and so I was trying to understand how you were scoping that board. So your definitions are really helpful, but I take it as scoping that board with that focus on the interests of the market participants is the sort of the vision there.
Yes, so let me get into this a little bit in terms of the qualifications, and then please feel free to ask any additional questions that you have. But in terms of the Market Plus governing board, we really wanted to think about what would they be responsible for, what would the composition look like, the qualifications. And again, this is a living, breathing document at the moment, very iterative. We expect that it is going to have a lot more meat on the bones when it actually becomes a proposal. But our initial thoughts were that they would have the authority over the tariff changes and business practices that were exclusive to SPP Markets Plus. And for a good amount of time until we ever got into some type of co-optimization with the Eastern Interconnection, full RTO, if you will, this is going to be really where the authority lies. So this independent board will really be the decision-making authority when it comes to tariff changes and business practices that are really relevant to the market participants in Markets Plus. We thought about a 5-member board versus a 3-member board, even though obviously that does add a little bit more cost and complexity. Just knowing that a 3-member board, if you did lose one, you then have quorum issues and it becomes more difficult to operate. In terms of qualifications, we want this board to meet the independence criteria as set out by FERC, which means financial independence from market participants. But we also want them to have some market experience. So not just have the type of qualifications that you might look for in a corporate board, but have experience working in RTO markets. And that does not necessarily mean in the West, because obviously we know there's really only one robust wholesale market in the West right now. So we would really be looking to leverage experience from across the nation in terms of knowledge of how markets work and some of the complexities around that. In order to effectuate a board, of course, we would need some type of nominating committee. And that's where we discussed that would have they would oversee the process to nominate potential members to the governing board. And it would be comprised of representatives of both market participants and the stakeholder sectors, including the state regulators or representatives of state regulators. Next slide, please. The Market Participants Executive Committee and Working Group committees are still going to be present in the 2A model, as David was alluding to. But where we're looking now is that the Market Participants Executive Committee are really not going to have any sort of final authority. It's really going to be in terms of their ability to make recommendations to that independent board. And the way we see it is they are gatekeepers, but the gate can't lock. So that's sort of the analogy that we've been using. So anything that does go to the board, aside from potentially things that are coming from the body of state regulators or whatever we're going to call that body, would need to flow through the Market Participants Executive Committee so that that committee could have an opinion, have an opportunity to present an opinion to the board. But again, that does not mean that they can foreclose any ideas or any issues from going to the board. The purpose would be to review, to also recommend working group proposals or issues for the working groups to deal with, and then also to make recommendations to the governing board. And the composition of the Market Participants Executive Committee would be limited to actual market participants. So again, those are folks that are bound by the rules of the tariff. The qualifications are, we're looking for senior management officials with binding financial decision-making authority. So signatory authority, the ability to make decisions. And then we're talking about the other, sector-based groups that we would see as part of the committee structure as being working groups. And those would be representatives of both market participants and various stakeholder sectors, including the state representatives where they felt that they wanted to be participating. The working groups could, deal with any of the potential issues that you might see coming up in an SPP Markets Plus construct. And we would expect that this would be really a two-way flow of information. So perhaps things come up through the working group process, or perhaps the Market Participants Executive Committee identifies issues that they then send down to a working group to help really flesh out and come up with a proposal. Before I move on, is there any questions on either this slide or the slide previous in terms of each of the roles that we've been talking about? Okay, I don't see any, so let's move on to the next slide. So in terms of what we're looking at in terms of leadership, meeting frequency, voting structure, these are things that we really wanted to get more stakeholder feedback on. And so some of this stuff is going to be, the committee is going to actually determine in terms of the meetings, they will be for the vast majority public except when noticed, with a transparent meeting purpose as to why they need to be closed. And that would be the case for both the Market Participants Executive Committee and the working groups. For the voting structures, for the Market Participants Executive Committee, we did want to make sure that we were giving the appropriate amount of, not deference, it's not really the right word, but the appropriate amount of sort of decisional or influential authority to those entities that ultimately have the reliability or obligations. And so we were thinking about a House and Senate model. So that would be that the House model would be based on some type of load ratio, and the Senate model would be 1-for-1 for all of the participants. This definitely has some testing out to do. We need to really think through that, but that's where our heads are at right now. For the working groups, it would just be a Senate 1-for-1 voting. And I saw that there was a question in the chat. So I see Doug from BPA, does the working group subsume a regional state committee of the type that exists in the SPP? I would say that the regional state committee, or whatever we're going to be determining there, would be outside of the working group. That's sort of going to have a dotted line to both the Market Participants Executive Committee and the SPP Markets Plus board. So I would see them as not necessarily being a working group, but we would expect that members of our version of the regional state committee or body of state regulators, whatever you want to call it within SPP Market Plus, that they would participate on the sector-based working group, depending on if it was something that they were interested in. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay, moving on to the next slide, please. In terms of potential SPP RTO governance modifications, we did think that it was still important to think about the independent SPP corporate board and whether or not now was a good time to amplify or implement some new criteria for those qualifications. So we talked about the possibility of making sure that at least 2, potentially 3 members of the SPP board had some type of experience in the Western interconnection, whether that be, as a former regulator or as a former executive or someone that worked in the Western interconnection, but having that specific experience. And then we also were exploring the idea of having a new member of the corporate governance committee that Joe spoke about before. They're the ones that actually nominate the members to the SPP board, that we wanted to make sure that we still had a voice on that committee in order to help seat that board. And so we are looking to potentially add a seat for Markets Plus and have that seat be a voting seat. Next slide, please. Some of the other issues that we started looking at were, governance modification process. So what would we need to do if we ever needed to modify this? Would there be a review time frame, exit provisions, appeals process? Some of this stuff we weren't able to fully vet because we were really busy working on some of those other matrices that you've seen. But one thing that we did talk about was having a 3-year governance review. So after 3 years, reviewing the governance in terms of if it still made sense and that it would have certain defined triggering conditions. So perhaps if 50% of the members of SPP Markets Plus join the RTO, that's the triggering condition. So we've talked about that a little bit. In terms of the appeals process, we would allow any market participant to appeal any action or inaction of the ultimate authority of the Markets Plus independent board. And, that's another process that we sort of need to talk through a little bit more, but it was one of the things that we had put out there in our initial discussions. Next slide, please.
Allie, could I just ask on the appeals process, which I recognize you've only just started on, but I'm curious about, the appeals process to the independent board at SPP in Arkansas has some limitations. Who are you envisioning has standing here in the West to appeal something to that ultimate authority? I assume that's what you mean by ultimate authority.
Yeah. So without getting into too much, because we're not really quite sure how this would work. When we were in Phoenix, we talked a little bit about there is a process within SPP's current legal process called a deemed approved, where if it's gotten unanimous approval by the committees, including the executive committee, that it doesn't even go to the board. It's deemed approved. And we had talked a little bit about, could that apply here? So would there be things where if there was unanimous approval of the committee, the market participants committee, as well as the other committees, like whatever state board or the working groups, whoever is bringing it to the Markets Plus independent body, would that be able to also have deemed approved authority? And we're still trying to work that out, because there's some questions within SPP's legal group as to whether we can do that. But that's where some of this appeals process came through, because currently in SPP's world, if it goes through all of those committees and it has unanimous approval, and therefore it's not going to the board, it's just going to be deemed approved, any member of the RTO can bring it to the attention of the board to be heard. And so we were trying to think about a similar process, but it definitely needs to be vetted more in terms of who could appeal. Would it just be market participants, or would it also be, other stakeholders, especially, frankly, state regulators? If the body of state regulators wanted to appeal something, could they appeal? We really need to think through this process a little bit more, frankly.
That's fair at this stage of development. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Anne, I see your hand up. If you're talking.
Sorry, I think I was double muted.
Okay.
Because I'm using my phone for audio. So in terms of the state committee, are you envisioning that the states will determine the scope of representation, or is this something that you all have ideas? Because I'm not sure it necessarily, I think in the EIM model, when the EIM Bosser was originally created, had the option not just for regulators, but for each state to determine who the representative was, because there are a number of states that have significant public power entities. And so having a state regulator be the representative may not necessarily be the best option. So just curious what the group was thinking, but it sounds like it's something that will be left to the states to determine what that committee looks like. And after, with an opportunity to figure out the connections to all the other committees, which I appreciate the transparency of and the ability to participate. But I just wanted to ask what was envisioned in terms of standing up that committee.
So can we advance the slides a little bit? Next. To here. Okay, this is purposefully blank. And the reason that it's purposefully blank is we got the principles that were sent by a number of the state regulators that had come together and submitted some principles. And so we really appreciated that. But there were no state regulators or really staff in the room in Phoenix. And, Commissioner Cordova was really generous with her time and joined us for the panel, but then she had to leave after that. And I would never presume that one state commissioner spoke for all of you. So what we did was leave this blank, and we did that on purpose because it's not really our place to determine what your committee is going to look like and how you want it to be structured. Of course, we are happy to be part of that process and be part of the iterative thinking about what is the best representative. But the state's committee, I would imagine, would, in terms of composition and qualifications, have to come from the committee itself. And how we start is a little bit tricky, but I think we're looking for feedback there, just to be perfectly transparent. Like we're not quite sure how to reconcile that fact that there's a lot of public power, and there's states with virtually no public power, or states where there's not as a bright line between regulated and unregulated, like we have in Arizona, for instance. So definitely looking for feedback here in terms of what you all think the composition and qualifications should be for the state's committee.
Thank you. And I think there is more conversation to be had. So thanks.
Absolutely. Okay, can we go back one slide, please? So we did get all of your principles, which, what we saw from those were board independence, making sure that there was this active stakeholder engagement with the transparency, ability to participate, that state committee would have a role in the policy development and decision making, and access, I would say, to not only the various other committees, but also to SPP staff. We heard that there should be some type of funding model similar to what we have in the Bosser model now, and what I expect we will also have in RAP, and independent board selection. So we definitely heard all of these things, and we want to continue that conversation. I know the state regulators have another meeting scheduled to kind of work through and iterate on this, and we expect to participate to the extent you would like us to participate and offer ideas. But again, I don't want to presuppose what those matrices should look like. I think that really needs to come from the regulators and staff, and frankly, other interested state officials from the various states that are participating. So can we advance the slides, please? Next. Okay, we've come to the questions and discussion portion of the matrices. I think I've answered some of them, but happy to open it up to feedback or other questions that any of you may have. I know that there's probably not quite as much in terms of meat on the bones as we might like, although we are going to get working. We have stakeholder comments that are coming in here at the end of the month, and we are really looking forward to seeing those. If you haven't had an opportunity to take a look at those, we definitely encourage that you do, and please submit, even if you only have 2 questions that you're interested in answering. That's great. We'd love to see those 2 questions answered. So with that, I think I'm turning it back over to Kara.
Thanks, Allie. Can we go to the next slide? She just did a great segue for us to the comment opportunity. We did issue a template on April 1st. If you are on the Markets Plus Explorer, you received that link. That deadline is the 20th, but I want to be very clear that part of this process that we're doing with WIEB is to provide a separate opportunity for regulators to comment collectively or individually. So please don't feel compelled to meet that April 20th deadline. We have accommodated a separate comment structure for you. You're welcome to look at that and submit individually if you'd like, of course, but know that there is a separate opportunity for you to be providing your comments to us. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a second. Next slide, please. So I promised I would hit on the remaining design elements. There are 4 more that we needed to talk about. 2 of those will be absorbed jointly by the existing design teams of transmission and market design, and that's congestion rent and seams. That leaves market monitoring and greenhouse gas tracking. The market monitor really are 3 options that will be presented during our standing April 27th webinar. You can register for that at spp.org. There's an external option, an internal option, and a hybrid option. So we have someone from SPP who will be presenting on those 3 options, and there will be a written comment opportunity following that webinar. We are also launching greenhouse gas tracking design team. Next slide, please. We're going to take a little bit of a different tact here because of the existing significant work that's already occurred in the West. We don't feel like we need to start from scratch. Instead, we want to leverage that experience and expertise and sort of start where you all are to figure out that piece of the market design component. So here are the guiding principles that we're starting with. Next slide, please. These are the 2 webinars that we have set up to discuss greenhouse gas design. Those are available for registration at spp.org. On the Markets Plus page, we've invited interested parties and parties who have concepts to present. And we have volunteers for both the April 20th and 17th. If you or anyone you know would like to participate in those, please let us know. We will have a written comment opportunity on those concepts, as well as a significant discussion about that in our June 1st and 2nd in-person meetings in Denver. So we'll be tackling that one and the market monitoring in Denver. Next slide, please. I'm going a little quickly because I know we're about out of time, but I'm happy to answer any questions on those remaining design principles before we go over sort of schedule and next steps.
Sarah, can I ask just a higher level question? When we went through the prior or the existing contract services and how they're governed, it wasn't clear to me, is RTO West, the RTO that the expansion of the Eastern RTO going to be a contract service, or does it, as folks step into that, they are coming in fully under sort of the SPP governance model? The RSC is setting the reserve margin and transmission cost allocation, and so that they aren't going to have a Western States Committee and so on. That'll all sunset, and they'll move into the market, the existing SPP governance structure.
It is the RTO. They will become members of the RTO. They have already sought 13 changes to the terms and condition package, which were approved by our board in July. We have remaining issues on the terms and conditions package related to the DC ties that we are continuing to work on. But you're correct, they become part of the RTO structure with those changes that they've negotiated to become members. In terms of the RSC, that will make 4 new states eligible for participation at the RSC: Montana, Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado. Utah, for example, has indicated they likely will not take a seat on the RSC because it's related to Deseret, which they don't have a ton of jurisdiction over. And they don't want to create the perception they have more jurisdiction over that entity than they do. So it'll be up to each state about whether they want to take their seat on the RSC, effective on launch date, which right now is late 2024. But they will become part of the RTO.
Okay, that's really helpful to understand the moving parts. So they'll be under the RSC's 205 rates at that point.
Correct.
Thanks.
Sure. All right, next slide, please. All right, next steps and schedule. I know we're hitting our limit, so I'll go quickly, not because I don't think this is important, but I just want to be respectful of all of your time. We're looking at this as a 5-part process. We are clearly in step 2, kind of at that bottom in terms of developing the detailed service offering. Got more detail on that on one of these other slides. Next slide, please. So this schedule is specifically related to the governance design team, and it incorporates what we'll be doing with all of you. So we mentioned the written comment period. Again, you don't have to comply with that one. If you'd like to, that would be fine. We will share with you in the greatest extent we can on April 22nd, 2 days after those comments are due, what those comments look like. We'll provide you a summary. I'll provide those to Maury, and he will distribute them to all of you. The comment template, if you haven't looked at it, we use a tool that can automate and compile those results. Many of them are yes, no, many of them are multiple choice. We'll get instantaneous feedback on those we can certainly share that with you immediately. We'll do our best to compile the long form answers as well and provide that to you in writing. We wanted to get that to you on Friday the 22nd because we are using our regularly scheduled webinar on the 25th to provide a summary of those written comments to everyone. We wanted you to have an inside glance on those. It's likely that we will be asking different entities to provide a summary of their written comments. So if you can attend that, it would give you a really good flavor verbally from a lot of different entities that have been participating in this, what their comments are on the matrices and other questions that we asked in the comment template. And then our regular development update will be on the 27th. As I mentioned, we will be talking about market monitoring there as well as design team updates. Then the next one of these WIEB webinars is scheduled for May 13th. And we're going to basically flip the order here. We are going to be in listening mode to have you tell us what your feedback is. You can do it with the matrices that Ali provided. You can do it on the comment template. You can do it off your principles. It's really up to you how you want to present your feedback to us for consideration. And then we've asked that you put that in writing and somehow. You can do it with the comment template. Again, you can do it with the matrices. You can provide us, a 30-page written comment. However you want to do it is how we'll take it. So we'd like to have that in no later, as quickly as you can after the 13th, whatever works for you. I know Maury will be setting up some private webinars for you to talk about that. And I think I'm supposed to let him do that on this slide. So I'll turn over to him in just a second. We've set the 23rd as a deadline for ourselves to provide in writing a governance design concept. That is our regularly scheduled webinar. We'd like to take advantage of that. We will present as much of that as we can there. And another reason we want to meet that deadline is because the in-person meeting in Denver is coming up shortly after that. And we want to be able to really dissect that written proposal at that point, address any gaps, develop any other details that need to, but really have something in front of people of a substantive nature that they can respond to. Maury, anything you'd like to add about the WIEB process here?
Kara, I'll wrap up with the WIEB process. You want to take your next slide and then
Sure.
I'll wrap up.
So this is really kind of the overview, kind of the high level schedule that we're trying to meet. So the governance piece is one of 8, as I mentioned, then that will go into the draft service offering, which is one of the reasons that we're sticking to the schedule that we have to make sure that we have a fully developed governance proposal by the time the service offering comes out, so that our piece of that is really well thought out. That'll be in the end of September. There will be a written comment period following that. And then our plan is to issue a final service offering with all the components of what Markets Plus would look like by mid-November. That does not go to the level of market protocols or tariff language. That's what we would do next year. But it should be enough to understand whether people are interested in pursuing this option. We'd like to get a commitment to investigate Q1 of 2023. There'll be some sort of financial binding to scope the implementation of what that looks like. Then we would spend most of next year working on the market protocols and tariff language, with that culminating in execution of participant agreements and funding the implementation of Markets Plus. Next slide. Okay, I think I got through all of that, Maury, if you want to add your piece.
So I'm going to jump in here again. So I want to thank Kara Fornstrom, Joe Fina, David Rubin, and Ali Kozlow for walking us through all this material. It's been very substantive. There's been some great questions, and I think we all learned a lot from today's presentation. So thank you to our presenters. Let me start there. I also want to announce that the Western Interstate Energy Board has hired a new government relations specialist. Her name is Gia Angiano. Hi, Gia. Gia is going to help us all craft a response to SPP in terms of both verbal comments and potentially some written comments. And I think we're thinking that we will have one private meeting with the state representatives prior to the CREPC-WIEB meeting, and then maybe one after the CREPC-WIEB meeting, but before the next webinar on May 13th, the next public webinar on May 13th. So look for an email from myself and Gia trying to set up those meetings. And Gia is going to help us focus on really the core issues and what's most important so that we can utilize your time efficiently. So with that, again, I want to thank Kara, Joe, David, Ali. Great job, guys. And if anybody has any questions about this process and how WIEB is going to work with the states, feel free to reach out to myself or Gia Gia, we need to get your email address on our website. So that's next to my to-do list.
And Maury, just one more quick thing. I just want to make it very clear. This is not going to be your only opportunity to comment. We plan to work closely with you. We do want to get this initial concept paper out. And then as Ali mentioned, I think we'll be iterative after that. We'll see what works best for you, but this is not the one and only chance. We will be hearing from you throughout this entire process.
Thank you, Kara. We really enjoy this collaboration and we'll be in touch. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon. If you have questions,
Thanks, everybody.
free to call.